a device condemned by a saint, mocked across a continent, and branded an offense against God. Today you pick it up 3 times a day without a thought. For most of human history, you ate with your hands. A knife cut, bread scooped, fingers finished the job. The fork simply did not exist at the table. Large 2-tined forks did exist in the ancient world, but only in the kitchen. Cooks used them to hold roasting meat over fire, not to bring food to the mouth. Greek and Roman cooks had big iron serving forks for lifting joints from the fire. A small, personal fork at your own place setting was simply unimaginable. In Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, something different was happening. Byzantine aristocrats had begun using small, 2-tined forks at table, made from silver or gold. Constantinople was the most sophisticated city in the medieval world. Elaborate rituals surrounded every meal, and at the highest levels of court, the fork was already part of the table. Around the year 1004, a Byzantine noblewoman named Maria Argyropouliana sailed west to Venice to marry Giovanni Orseolo, son of the Doge of Venice. Maria brought the customs of the Byzantine court with her, including a small golden fork, which she used at the wedding feast, lifting food to her lips with 2 tines. Guests at the feast had never seen anything like it. Venice watched in bewilderment as this princess refused to touch her food with her fingers. Word spread quickly through the city. A reformist monk and cardinal named Peter Damian heard about Maria's fork and was outraged. He wrote that her refusal to touch food with her fingers was an act of sinful vanity. When Maria died of plague just a few years later, Peter Damian declared it God's punishment for her excessive delicacy. The fork, in his telling, was an offense against Scripture. With that condemnation, the fork vanished from Italian tables for generations. No one wanted a utensil that a prominent churchman had linked to divine retribution. But Italy kept trading with Byzantium, and ideas moved with goods. By the 13th century, Venetian and Florentine merchant records begin mentioning forks alongside knives and spoons. A Florentine inventory from around 1360 lists several forks among a wealthy family's possessions. Still rare, still expensive, but they exist quietly in the record. Using a fork was considered effeminate in much of medieval Europe. Real men ate with hands and knives. The fork implied you were too delicate to touch your own food. By the late 15th century, Italian aristocrats had largely embraced the fork. At the courts of Florence and Ferrara, setting a table without one was starting to feel incomplete. In 1533, Catherine de' Medici left Florence to marry the future King Henry II of France. She reportedly brought Italian silverware with her, forks included. Historians debate how much credit Catherine actually deserves. The story may be partly legend, but French court records do mention forks more frequently in the decades after her arrival. Even so, France resisted for decades. The French considered the fork an Italian affectation, unnecessary, precious, and vaguely ridiculous. Eating with fingers was natural. The fork was performance. In 1608, an English traveler named Thomas Coryat crossed the Alps into Italy on a walking tour of Europe, carrying a notebook and an open mind. Coryat was fascinated by one thing: Italians were eating with small personal forks. He watched, he asked questions, and at some point bought one and put it in his bag. Back in England, Coryat published his travels in a book called Coryat's Crudities in 1611. He described the Italian fork habit enthusiastically and admitted he now used one himself. England was not impressed. Coryat was mocked relentlessly. Friends gave him the nickname Furcifer, Latin for fork-bearer, and also, pointedly, a word meaning rascal or villain. Critics argued that if God had intended people to use forks, he would not have given them fingers. The fork wasn't just unnecessary, It was an affront to divine design. For much of the 17th century, fork use in England was a sign of eccentricity at best, pretension at worst. The knife and the hand still ruled the English table. But in France, the tide was shifting. Louis XIV, the Sun King, reportedly loved the fork, and at Versailles, what the king loved, the court adopted without hesitation. By the 1680s, dining with a fork at the French court had gone from curiosity to expectation. To eat without one was to mark yourself as provincial and behind. French influence on European taste was enormous. As French court culture spread across the continent's aristocracies, the fork followed, slowly at first, then suddenly everywhere at once. The early fork had just 2 straight tines. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, makers began adding a 3rd tine, then a 4th. The form was still being negotiated. Sometime in the early 18th century, craftsmen introduced a slight curve to the tines. This made the fork far more useful for scooping soft foods, peas, rice, tender vegetables. By around 1750, the 4-tined curved fork had become the standard across much of Western Europe. The shape had found its final answer. It has barely changed since. England, which had mocked the fork for a century, became one of its greatest makers. Sheffield, already famous for steel blades, turned its craft to cutlery with enormous success. By the late 18th century, Sheffield was producing forks, knives, and spoons for the British Empire and beyond. Quality English cutlery became a global export and a mark of civilization. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Machines stamped and polished forks by the thousands. What had been a luxury item for aristocrats began its long march toward the ordinary household. Before industrialization, a set of silver forks was a possession of the wealthy. By the mid-19th century, mass-produced steel forks cost nearly nothing. The working class got their forks. America was a late adopter. Well into the early 19th century, American dining was largely fork-free. European visitors noted it with alarm. Fingers and knives were still the norm. Americans developed a distinctive habit that persists today. They cut food with a fork in the left hand, then switch it to the right to eat. Europeans never made that switch. In 1913, Sheffield metallurgist Harry Brearley accidentally discovered stainless steel while trying to improve gun barrels. Within years, it transformed the fork, rust-free, cheap, and essentially permanent. By the mid-20th century, a matched set of stainless steel cutlery was a wedding gift, a housewarming staple, a basic expectation of domestic life across the industrialized world. As Western dining culture spread through trade and globalization, so did the fork. Today it appears on tables from Lagos to Tokyo, alongside chopsticks, beside flatbread, next to injera. By some estimates, more than 200 billion plastic forks are produced globally every year. Single-use, disposable, 1,000 years of hard-won status, used once and thrown away. Cities from San Francisco to Paris have begun banning single-use plastic cutlery. The fork that once symbolized refined civilization is now at the center of a debate about what civilization costs. Consider what it took for the fork to win: a millennium of ridicule, papal condemnation, national pride, cultural stubbornness, and one Byzantine princess who simply refused to eat with her hands. Few objects on your table fought as hard to be there as the fork. It traveled from Constantinople to Venice, from mockery in England to mandate at Versailles. The next time you pick up a fork, consider Maria Argyropoulos, condemned for using one, dead before 30, and quietly vindicated by about 10 billion people every single day. The smallest changes in how humans eat reveal the largest shifts in how they see themselves, what it means to be civilized, refined, or simply human at the table. This is Origins, Subscribe and come back tomorrow. There's a new origin every single morning.